I don't, let's see. I think I think so far it's 2 o'clock now, a few minutes after two. I will monitor the waiting room, but I certainly want to be mindful of everyone's time. Does this feel like a good time to get started? Does anyone need anything? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for being here on this very important day. My name is Renisa from the 1027 Healing Partnership, and I'm very grateful for everyone who's on the call today. And Beth, I'm gonna pass this over to you to get everyone started.
Okay. So when we started thinking about how to memorialize this tragic event that happened here in Pittsburgh, we had three ideas that the world is based on Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. And every year we've tried to do each of those things. So we've had both in person, and then we started doing virtual Torah study in 2020 with the pandemic. And the three congregations meet and say Kaddish together, and there are various volunteer projects around the community. So we really appreciate everybody joining us today, and we really appreciate the teacher taking the time to teach us. So every year, the committee tries to find different teachers that we think will have something meaningful to say to the community that will help give us just some chizuk, some encouragement, something at this difficult time. And for me personally, literature is a very important way to heal and trying to think about how to tell stories and how to use creativity in understanding how to cope with the world. So when I came across Rabbi Zierler's book, Going Out with Knots, my two Kaddish years with Hebrew poetry, I was excited. And when I read it, I was even more excited because it's a wonderful book. I've written a review that hasn't been published yet, but I really I gained a lot from it. And what's really interesting about her book and why I thought she could be helpful to us is that during the time she was saying Kaddish for both her parents, unfortunately, her father was in an accident and then her mother died of an illness 5 days after she was done saying Kaddish after her father
5 days
had passed away.
before.
I'm
five
sorry,
days
4 days.
before.
Okay, after she finished saying Kaddish for her father, she was spending 2 years saying Kaddish, and she would teach Hebrew poems every week at her synagogue, the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, and had a listserv that she would send out. So she has her PhD in comparative literature from Princeton University, undergrad from Stern College. And she's held teaching positions at a variety of places. She's currently a professor at Hebrew Union College in New York. And she's published on movies and midrash, on Hebrew poetry. And so this is her first, right, her first memoir, her first personal. So it was very exciting for me to see someone who's a scholar and has a scholarly understanding of something and is able to, combine her academic understanding with an emotional understanding of let's how to understand uh, texts and how to understand our place in the world. So I just want to read a quote that she offers from Yehuda Amichai before I let her speak for herself. So Yehuda Amichai said, "Poetry to me is a kind of remedy. It's never a poison. It's not escapist. It's not a drug. It's more like an antidote. A horse is used to produce anti-tetanus vaccine. It goes through the tetanus and recovers and becomes immune. And from the blood of the horse, the serum is made. In the same way, the poet uses the matter of his life to cure himself." So I just thought that was a really beautiful idea, using the matter of life to cure yourself. And we're very excited to see how Rabbi Zieler sees poetry being added to the canon of the Siddur. And particularly, she has a number of women's voices that are interesting. So I'm not sure which chapter she's going to present, but I'm looking forward to whatever it is that she'll be presenting today. So thank you, Rabbi Dr. Zieler. Oh, I forgot to add, she has a MFA from Sarah Lawrence, and she has ordination from Yeshivat Maharat in New York. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Beth, for that introduction, and thank you so much for this really moving opportunity to talk about my book in the context of this yard site, this commemoration of the tragedy of the Tree of Life massacre. I'm just going to share my screen now so that we can follow along together. What I want to do with you in the time that I have allotted is to, yeah, say a few things about the origin of this book and then explain to you the title. Explain to you the title through, hopefully, we have enough time, through different poem teaching examples that actually build on the title. I spent a major effort with my publisher convincing them that this should be the title because they thought, oh, it's going to be too obscure. What does it even mean? And so I felt, well, it is a bit of a mystery to know what going out with knots could possibly mean. So I'm going to begin to answer with the origin, the personal life story origin of that title, and then explain the way in which it became a controlling metaphor throughout this memoir that I was building around my experience of mourning my two parents. I just want to say, to put in the forefront what this occasion is, and to have in mind the names of those who were so cruelly massacred on October 27th, 18th of Cheshvan, 2018, um, because that's the most important thing that we have in mind, their specific stories and their specific tragedies. I was especially drawn to this early Pittsburgh Post-Gazette photo, this early report in the Pittsburgh Press, because I went through something similar with the tragic death of my father. This is an internet post on March 12th, 2019, the day that my father, while he was getting out of his car and walking in a parking lot to meet a friend, was tragically struck dead by a distracted truck driver. And here, this is an example of a news story that came out even before they could mention his name, because we had not yet been told. Um, uh, the strange fact of him having been in a McDonald's, even though he was an Orthodox Kashrut observer, is something that I ought to explain. My dad was, well, we come from a small town in Western Ontario, Sarnia, Ontario. At the time that my father was killed, I had been involved in a very close writing partnership with my dad, in that I was writing a book of fiction, stories that were loosely based on his experience growing up in this small town, our family's experience in this small town. My family, yeah, around the time that this all happened, I was working on a story that dealt with the aftermath of the death of my paternal grandmother, who was also hit by a car and killed. So there was this terrible refrain to my family's story, that we keep on having these same sort of experiences. And so I was writing this story about how my father, a character built around my father, was worn down by the experience of trying to gather together a minion in the aftermath of his mother's death, when in a small town, when that is such a major undertaking to try and grab to get together people, in this case men or boys older than 13, to say Kaddish. And that burden, that privilege and that burden of Kaddish recitation, where you want very much to just process your own sorrow, and yet the tradition doesn't let you, right? You're forced to do this in the context of a group.
Mm.
And so this journey and this responsibility that we all have in the Jewish tradition, when we have a personal loss, to translate it into a communal experience, is something that I was dealing with as I was listening to my father, not knowing that very soon I myself would be thrust into that same sort of experience. Add to this that my father's death was followed in less than a year by my mother's death, and uh, that was in January of 2020. And 6 weeks later, we were all thrown into the COVID experience, where the reflexive expectation of being able to continue the habit of saying Kaddish with a group of people was interrupted by this worldwide pandemic. And so the sense of the personal was automatically subsumed by the communal. And so I realized that this experience of mine on many levels was going to be about translating the personal into the public, translating my idiosyncratic experience into ways that that could relate to and connect to others. Now, you may be familiar with the fact that it is a custom in the 30 days after someone loses a loved one to engage in this, again, communal project of Mishnah study. That it's customary those 30 days that you take the six orders of the Mishnah and their various tractates, and you task different family members and friends to study a tractate of the Mishnah, so that by the end of the 30 days, the whole all the six orders of the Mishnah could be completed, and then you do a ritual siyum. And so our family undertook this, our family and friends. The idea behind studying Mishnah in the aftermath of a loss is it's a play on the words neshama and Mishnah, that they have the same letters. So it's a way of elevating the soul. And what I decided to do as my participation in this family experiment was to undertake study of Tractate Shabbat. My family's experience with Shabbat observance is pretty heroic, I would say. Um, our family, like I said, we came from this small town in Western Ontario, and where all of our relatives lived. And at a certain point, my parents decided that for the sake of Jewish observance and communal engagement, we needed to leave this small town and move to Toronto. And my father gave up a thriving business. It's something that was unthinkable at the time, very countercultural to put, he gave up the thriving business for the sake of the Jewish community and for the sake of Jewish observance so that he could stop working on Shabbat. And so Shabbat observance became, for me, was a kind of shortcut for thinking about my father and his core values, his real commitments to the Jewish people. And so I was back in Toronto visiting my mother shortly after my father's death. I had expected to be there at that particular time in order to give my father the green card that I had managed to acquire for them. We were concerned about my parents being in Toronto by themselves while my siblings and I all live in New York. I had gotten this green card. It was such an achievement. And lo and behold, he was killed. There was no need for it. Anyway, I was back home visiting my mother, and she knew that I had taken on the somewhat counterculturally also, I had taken on the practice of wearing a talit when I pray, even though that's not done in the Orthodox community that I grew up in. And so she gave me my father's talit to wear from now on. And the very first morning that I was wearing my father's talit at morning minyan in my parents' community, and I had taken along my little pocket Mishnah so I could sneak in a Mishnah study during the down times of the service. This was the Mishnah that I studied. And I'm not kidding, this actually happened. This is not just a cool thing to stick in a memoir. So and you'll see why this is kind of outrageous and difficult. So the Mishnah that I studied, it was within the context of a larger discussion about what you're allowed to carry on your person on Shabbat. We know that carrying from a public domain to a private domain, or a private domain to a public domain, is considered work on Shabbat. Think about hauling water or logs and so on. And so the question is, what is clothing, and what accessories might be considered extra carrying? And so the rabbis say, Habanim yotzim biksharim, that young boys, sons, can go out on Sabbath with knots. And then they go on to talk about how princes, aristocratic people, can wear bells. These might be considered extra. They might qualify as carrying rather than just clothing. And so then the first question that is raised is, what are these knots that the rabbis are talking about? People always assume, based on this prompt, here that it's a talit, but actually that's not at all the case. The talit is considered clothing. So what are these knots? And at first there's a discussion in the Gemara, the Talmud commentary on this Mishnah. Perhaps these are medicinal knots that sons can wear. I don't know, some kind of aromatherapy knots on their person when they go out on Shabbat. But then the rabbis say, well, that doesn't make any sense, because if it's medicine and needed, well, then daughters could do that too. The assumption that it's specifically sons. And actually, it doesn't need to be young people, it would be older people who would need the remedy too. And so the commentary that I read that morning that explained it to me, which is one of the classic commentaries on the Mishnah. It's Obadiah ben Abraham of Bartanura, often referred to as the Bartanura. We think about Bartanura, the blue bottle, sparkly wine. The Bartanura from the 15th century, he glosses this as follows: a son who has longings for his father, the father takes a strap from the right shoe and ties it to the child with his left, onto his left arm. And while this tie is upon him, the longings depart from him. And that's okay. So there's some sort of notion of boys missing their fathers and taking a knot of something that belongs to the father, either from the shoe or some other thing, and tying it either to the boy's shoe or the boy's arm. And that knot will make the boy stop missing his father. And then the commentary went on to say, and that's why the Mishnah speaks of sons, not daughters, for daughters don't have longings for their fathers. So there I was in shul, desperately missing my father, desperately grieving his tragic loss, wearing his talit, deeply connected and emotionally to him, being told by the tradition that I'm trying to connect with in his memory in order to elevate his soul, telling me that I don't miss my father. And there are, from the women's section of my parents' shul, I literally let out a gasp and said, "What? How could that possibly be? What and what am I going to do about this? I'm engaged. I mean, I believe very fervently in the value of Torah study. I don't want my Torah study to be the kind of thing that gets in my way and breaks the connection. I was trying to figure out how some regimen of study could enable me to reconnect, to tighten the knots. Now I'll add to this, going back to the Mishnah. There, oh, I don't know why that just got rid of that. Close. So the Mishnah, you may recall, said sons go out with knots and princes go out with bells. And then the rabbis step back and say, actually, everyone can go out with bells, but rather the sages, when they initially promulgated this, they were speaking Dibru behoveh. They were speaking in the language of their time, when these aristocratic designations were strong and meaningful. And what they were suggesting is that, our definitions of what's permissible or not permissible or relevant in terms of clothing distinctions might change depending on your hoveh, on your time. And one of my teachers at Yeshivat Maharat, Rabbi Jeffrey Fox, told me that I ought to read the first part of the Mishnah with that Ella dibru chachamim ba'oveh, hoveh, their sages spoke in the language of their present time, to connect that to that, perhaps in the same way that the rabbis can envision a doing away of the distinction between princes and regular folk, that we could imagine a doing away of the distinction between sons and daughters, depending on changing norms. If I wanted, if I was cheered by that commentary, I had another setback in reading the commentary of Rashi on the Talmudic gloss of this Mishnah. Rashi, when he writes about ga'aguin, about longings, he explains that this is a son who longs for his father and can't separate him from him. By the way, I'll note that another commentary specifically makes a point of saying that this longing comes in the circumstance of a father's death. It's not evident on the text, from the text, that that's what it's about, but some made sense of this by saying that it was a son who longed for a father who was no longer with him in the world. So Rashi says that they would use these straps in order to help the boy with longings. And this remedy is not relevant for females. That a father never loves a daughter that much or shows affection for a daughter that much from her beginning. That a daughter would ever have longing for her father. And so I'm happy to invite comments or reactions to this. I'll just note that it's commonly known historically that Rashi only had daughters and didn't have any sons.
And
And so, yes,
didn't
Carol.
Rashi's daughters wear tefillin?
So this is a legend, commonly repeated legend. We have no basis for understanding that. I actually think that that notion of Rashi's daughters wearing tefillin might emanate perhaps from this, because there's a moment toward the end of the Talmudic passage that talks about this act of tying from your right hand to your left as a mnemonic for how you wrap tefillin, right? In a very right-handed centric way, that a righty takes the strap and wraps it this way on the left. There's an article by someone named Ari Zivotofsky that probed this whole question of whether or not Rashi's daughters wore tefillin. But there is this notion that daughters who have a privileged access to learning or to kind of power, that they wore tefillin, so that we have a tradition that is mentioned in the Talmud that Michal, the daughter of Saul, that she wore tefillin. Whatever the case may be, what we do know about Rashi's daughters is that they had a privileged access to learning, and not just that. Tradition has it that they served as Rashi's secretaries, scribes, amanuenses, where he would write down his commentaries and they would copy them. And so, what I want to share with you is one of the poems that I taught over the course of the 2.5 years of teaching that went on to comprise this book. Let me just step back for a second and explain. So I showed you how I was involved in a traditional regimen of learning for the first 30 days, and I kind of hit up against the wall of sensibility, like the sense that the tradition wasn't speaking for me. And shortly thereafter, in my extraordinary synagogue in Riverdale, I was asked to join the Devar Torah rotation for morning tefillah. We have this incredible group of people that would come to Minyan, among them great scholars, founders of institutions, and so on. And so I was asked to take a day where I could teach a class. And I said, okay, fine, I'll do that. But I kind of have to do it my own way. I need to like speak Behoveh in my own language of the everyday. And what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is I'll choose and translate and teach a different modern Hebrew poem every week that will relate in some way either to the matters of mourning or to prayer or to stuff going on in the day. And that will be my class. And so that's what I did. And the book became not just a Kaddish memoir, but also a memoir woven through this experience of the poems that I taught. I would basically live with one poet for about 5-6 months until I kind of exhausted the well, and then move on to another poet and move on to another poet. I'm not, with the material that I'm presenting with you today does not follow that order. I wanted instead, apropos of this idea of explaining where the title comes from, Going Out with Knots, to give you 3 poems that deal with knots or deal with this theme and that represent a different expression of need or answering a need in a time of grief. Beth, did you have a question? That was a hand? No. So this first poem that oh yes, Yael?
Oh no, I was gonna say something about before you get into the poems for the last commentary. I think it was the Bartanura that you showed.
Yes.
Um, at the end, that in the English you translate, or the translation was that the daughters don't love their fathers, but in the Hebrew it says they don't love like their father or like the sons. The daughters don't long like the sons. So it's like that was a little interesting.
So the Bartanura said,
Kamoa
well,
banim.
in it says, "Lahakitani habanim she'en labanot gaguin al avihen kemo habanim."
Yeah.
That daughters don't have longings for their fathers like the sons. Yes. So, I mean, what that's acknowledging, and I think it's fair historically, is that in a gender separated world where boys were socialized to be with their fathers and girls socialized to be with their mothers, there might have been a difference in the way that um, sons missed their dads. But I don't know, most of us who have had kids or have been kids recognize that there's something pretty profound between daughters and dads. I don't think that we needed Freud to tell us that, right? So,
Yes, and I will just share with you that 26 years ago, when I was saying Kaddish for my father, I was at the Hebrew Institute, and I found the daily minyan there very difficult as a woman.
mm,
At that time, it was in the little bite, and it
mm.
was not particularly pleasant. Shabbat was fine, so I ended up for the daily minyan at Park Avenue Synagogue. It was just.
Yeah, well, my book in general deals with the difficulty of saying Kaddish in Orthodox communities writ large. I have to say that nowadays the Hebrew Institute is probably as friendly an Orthodox synagogue as you can get in terms of Kaddish recitation. Even so, and, you know, the fact we managed to get all kinds of parts for women. Um, you know, men who are saying Kaddish are often referred to as a chiyuv, like that they're the personification of obligation, and women are just kind of, if they're allowed to say Kaddish in an Orthodox synagogue, they're certainly not given a part. We agitated and achieved liturgical changes in our synagogue around Kaddish recitation. And we have other things that have been that are incredible, including this regular Dvar Torah rotation, which included men and women, and also the opportunity for people saying Kaddish on yard sites to talk about their relatives.
No, it's been a long time, and it was Hebrew Institute was a wonderful, wonderful home. So it was not in any way a criticism.
No, no, I'm not taking it that way, but I think that the incremental changes sometimes they feel geological in how
Mhm.
slow they are. Okay, so apropos of this last Rashi, which seemed so incendiary for a feminist, 2 years into my teaching, I had moved on to the one contemporary poet in the group, the poet Ruchama Weiss, who lives in Jerusalem. She was a colleague of mine at Hebrew Union College. She's a Talmudist, a bibliotherapist, a weekly columnist. I mean, she's a novelist. She's so many things. I found this poem of hers, Kina al Bnot Rashi, Lament on Rashi's Daughters, which actually, 2.5 years into this journey, which actually addressed this specific poem. Excuse me, this specific Mishnah. And it's a lament for what she imagines Rashi's daughters might have felt had they indeed been Rashi's scribes. That would have meant that they would have read that commentary too, as they're trying to connect to their father, as they're trying to be so dedicated to his project. They are hitting up against this wall of their fathers saying fathers never love their daughters. So this is the poem that the translation that I wrote of Ruchama's poem. How they sat, Miriam, Yocheved, and yet another daughter left without name. By the way, we know that there were four. There was a daughter who also died in childbirth or very young. That's what we learned in girls' school. Night after night, they sat after the last student left. They poured hot drinks for father, caressed his words, wrote down his commentaries. On their last legs, with yawning eyes, they wrote with love, with longing, this last commentary too. And he doesn't miss them, and he has no extra love. He has no remedy of relevance to females. It was decreed that they should write and wait with heavy hands and unrequited longing. They should wait for him finally to show them fondness. One day, perhaps, he will long for them or hear their longings. With the coming of his grandsons, Rabbeinu Tam and the Rashbam, their merit should protect us. So what this poem is recognizing, as I mentioned, is this sense that Rashi's daughters had committed themselves to and tied themselves to their father's project of Torah study, even though there must have been a lot of insult along the way, a lot of tugging and threatening, moments threatening to snap the connection, and yet they don't leave. I think that was something that I also was experiencing as I was going through my journey, that I was coming up against things that were not perfect, that were less than ideal in terms of the actualizations of my values. And yet I was trying to balance competing needs to remain connected to community, remain connected to the kind of community that my parents gave up a lot for us to be connected to. Um, and also acknowledging the possibility in that very gender separated world that Rashi's daughters, when they finally gave birth to these great luminary sages, Jacob Tam and Rabbi Solomon ben Meir, the first Tosafists and first commentaries on Rashi's writings, that maybe finally they would have been acknowledged and given chiba, given that kind of love. I'll also note that the poem repeats the word ga'agua for longing, for missing. And that word ga'agua itself is such a wonderful Hebrew word. It includes these repetitions, of gaga sounds of baby sounds, like pre-linguistic longing. And so it speaks to those things that are even behind or after or before language. Okay, so this is taking us, this poem was taught much earlier in the book, and much earlier in my journey. The book, I should note, the book starts with the poet Leah Goldberg. I'm not going to be talking about her today, but you can ask me some questions. It starts when my father had died, and I was moving my mother from Toronto to live just a block away from me in Riverdale. But that was actually not the first poet that I taught. The first poet that I taught in this class that I gave called Shir Chadash El Yom was a Chabad poet named Tzvi Yair, who happens to be my brother-in-law's uncle. And I thought, okay, that would be a safe way to introduce poetry into an Orthodox synagogue, to bring an Orthodox Chabad poet, someone that nobody knew, and was an American Hebrew poet. I was so excited to bring his poetry to the fore. I wrote all this material about him, and then I wasn't given permission to include that in the book. Perhaps because I teach at Hebrew Union College. I don't know. There was some notion that they were going to put out a book of his poems, and they wanted to maintain a proprietary connection. But maybe, like the real tikkun will be if I can add that into the rotation later on. The first poet I taught that shows up in the book is Leah Goldberg, the first canonical modern Hebrew woman poet. And then after that, I taught Avram Chalfi, who is a big favorite among secular Israelis, especially because Arik Einstein took a lot of his poems and set them to music, that heartthrob Israeli pop singer. And then I taught the poetry of Yehuda Amichai, who's probably the best known modern Hebrew poet outside of Israel, the most widely translated, should have won a Nobel Prize, if not for the fact that Israel was not going to get a Nobel Prize for literature after 1967. It just wasn't going to happen because of the politics. This particular Yehuda Amichai I talk about in my book was especially important to me because he was the poet that I studied with as an undergraduate, who basically led me to the decision to undertake the career that I undertook, to study Hebrew literature. I had the great privilege, Carol, of taking a class with him at the Park Avenue Synagogue. 2 days with Yehuda Amichai and his basically tour through modern Hebrew poetry, actually through Hebrew poetry from the Middle Ages to the present, and that's how I fell in love with him and the idea of approaching Torah study through modern literature that way.
Well,
And
when Beth introduced you, I already wanted to be you. I was already envious that I wasn't you, and that you've just, sort of doubled down on that.
well, there you go.
Nice to be able to study with you even for a little bit.
Thank you. So this was the Yehuda Amichai section of the book is very dear to me. It actually overlapped with the a major chunk of our COVID experience, including our COVID high holidays, which were, if you all recall what that was, COVID in people's backyards or COVID by Zoom. Yehuda Amichai is a sort of poet who takes the heaven and brings it down to earth. If he engages with God, it's always in very, very earthly, in some cases like subversive ways, bringing the heavens right down to like the basement of human experience. This particular poem I taught the week after the Kaddish for my mother ended. So this is after 22 months of straight Kaddish. 20 and realizing that it had become so ingrained a habit to say those words 8 times a day that it was almost unthinkable to not pronounce them, to be in synagogue and have Kaddish start and to not say those words. And the week after the Kaddish ended for my mom, I found myself repeatedly joining in. I couldn't, it was like a habit I couldn't break. And so I was entertaining what it means to maintain connections when they are broken, either broken because of factors outside of your control, like a tragic death, or because of the natural course of the ending of a ritual. How do you carry that prior experience with you? How does it translate or transmute or transform in ways that can be sustaining? This particular poem by Yehuda Amichai, Mishi Hitatef B'Talit, whoever wrapped in a talit, is about his own experience having grown up Orthodox, immigrated from Germany as a child, and was raised in Orthodox schools as a youth, but then in his teen years departing religious observance. And in many instances, he refers to the ways of his father, or not, lies that he tells his father on Erev Shabbat about not going to about going to shul when he didn't go to shul, right? Um, this is about how even if you leave, these experiences stay with you, or even if they end, they transform in different ways. Um, so this is the poem in translation. And by the way, I will note that part of the theme of this poem is translation, and part of the theme of my book is translation, how we translate the personal into the communal, the private loss into shared loss, how we go from right to left and left to right on the page of a siddur, how metaphor can allow us to translate our own experience into something that other people can understand or relate to. So, and this, and because Amichai was so readily translated, he was aware of what translation could do as a phenomenon in terms of people understanding one another, or what it can't do, the limits of translation. Whoever was wrapped in talit in youth will never forget taking it out of the soft velvet bag, opening the folded talit, spreading it out, kissing the length of the neckband, some neckbands embroidered, others trimmed in gold. After that, with a great unfurling overhead like a sky, a wedding canopy, a parachute, and then winding it around your head as if playing hide and seek, and then wrapping your whole body in it so close, tucking into it like a cocoon of a butterfly, then opening up as if with wings to fly. And why is the talit striped and not checkered black and white like a chessboard? Because squares are finite and hopeless. Stripes come from endlessness and go to endlessness, like runways in an airport where angels land and take off. Whoever is wrapped in a talit will never forget when you climb out of the swimming pool or the sea. You wrap in a large towel, spread it out again over your head, and again tuck into it so close, and still shiver a bit and laugh and bless. Okay, so what this poem is doing is it's expressing this experience of having had a deep visceral connection to religious observance as a youth and leaving that, and yet the intimate sensations of that childhood religious observance never go away. Even if the theological implications are changed, or even if the God-centeredness is transmuting in a certain sense. what what he does is he uses a whole succession of metaphors or similes to liken one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, to show how there can be a continuity of experience even when there is this disruption, right? The putting of the talit is compared to a sky, a wedding canopy, a parachute. It's compared to hide and seek. It's compared to tucking in like a cocoon of a butterfly, which itself is a figure of transformation, right? The cocoon, the caterpillar turns into a cocoon, which turns into a butterfly. And those are almost unrecognizable entities, if not for the fact that we know that they're connected to one another. So things that seem so disparate can be constructed, or they can be tied together in a string of associations. And then he talks about the talit as a runway in an airport, specifically because the talit has stripes and not squares, because the squares would limit you and box you in and make it impossible for you to transcend that shape or move from that shape into something else. So runways in an airport, where he imagines an airport being an everyday technological thing, and he actually imagines an airport where angels take off. The supposed non-believer is bringing angels into aeronautics, right? And then he does the typical Amichai thing, where he takes a lofty theological construct, God, angels, and he brings it to the beach on Shabbat in Tel Aviv, right? If you leave religious observance, what do you do instead of going to shul on Shabbat? You go to the beach. You go to the beach. And he says that he compares the experience of wrapping in a talit to wrapping in a large towel, and shivering, shivering from that sense of religious trembling or the actual physical cold, and laughing and blessing. And finding a way to connect that joy, that alternative Shabbat experience, to what it meant for him as a young kid to be connected to his parents' ways, and imagining that the heretical, or the disobedience or the disloyalty of leaving religiosity can be compensated by this metaphorical connection. I want to pause if anybody would like to make a connection before I move on to the next example. Um, I should add that here's a provocative picture. This is a picture of me saying the last Kaddish for my mother in 2021. So we were back in synagogue, we were back in shul for minyan, but we were socially distanced, wearing masks. I should note that I took on wearing talit when my daughter had her bat mitzvah. I had to try and figure out, as a person who grew up in the Orthodox world, how I make such a radical move to take on a mitzvah that is not typical of my community. And so it felt right for my daughter's bat mitzvah, to when she was taking on mitzvot, that I could do this. But when my mom died, and I was aware that one Kaddish was going to just be flowing into the next, as if there was no difference, and yet they were two distinct losses. I said, now's a time. At the time I was studying for smicha at Yeshivat Maharat, and aware of what that meant, to be taking on the responsibility of becoming a rabbi. And so I used that opportunity to begin wearing tefillin. And the person who taught me how to laniach tefillin, how to lay tefillin, is my son, whose name is Amichai, who we named with Yud Amichai in mind. And so that itself was an incredible deviation from tradition. I mean, not just that I'm a woman putting on tefillin, when, perhaps there were some women in our tradition who did that, but it was not something that the rabbis encouraged. But that instead of a parent teaching me how to do this, or a bat mitzvah teacher, it was my son. And how difficult it was to take on that mitzvah. It's very conspicuous. Um, it's a tough thing to get the straps in place and to keep them in place. I always felt that I was doing it somehow incorrectly, and trying to get the straps to go back on. Just aware of the awkwardness of it. and trying to make it natural, to try to acquire the ease of a certain mitzvah that my son did with in a such a second nature way from the time he was 13. But it also meant a lot to me, and I talk about that experience of learning how to lay tefillin in the book, and also I wrote a poem about it that's included in the book. Okay, now for the last poem on this subject of ties. There is a whole chapter in my book about this figure, Rachel Lutzato Murpurgo, who was the first modern Hebrew woman poet. And I need to stress a historical fact that from the time of the closing of the biblical canon to the end of the 19th century, there was not a single Hebrew book published by a woman. So just digest that fact, because it was something that obsessed me when I was in graduate school, and it led me to write my first book, which is called And Rachel Stole the Idols, The Emergence of Modern Hebrew Women's Poetry, where Rachel Lutzato Murpurgo, as well as the poet Rachel Blavstein, who is also in my book, there are a few different Rachel figures. They were very important to me. That idea that you could have centuries of Jewish learning, you could go into any Jewish library and see walls upon walls of those hardback books with the gold letters and the marbleized outside, and that no woman had written a single one of them, and what that gaping silence means. Until finally, in the end of the 19th century, you have this first modern Hebrew woman poet, and you have the first women prose writers. And my book was about what that means when women finally enter into the conversation, how that inevitably has to affect the way in which women are represented. What new takes do they have on longstanding themes where they were written about but never had a chance to represent themselves? And so when I was in the lead up to my ordination in the spring of 2021, I was trying to connect to predecessor figures, so that what I was doing should not seem like this huge departure from tradition. And one of the figures who was really important to me was Rachel Lutzato Murpurgo, who came from the famed Lutzato family. Rabbi Moses Chaim Lutzato is a great uncle. Shmuel David Lutzato, the biblical commentator, was her chavruta, her study partner, her first cousin. And she was fully conversant in Talmud, in Kabbalah, in Bible, and she knew enough Hebrew at a time when Hebrew was not a vernacular for anybody, to be able to write this very carefully crafted, rhymed, metered, scholarly, elusive poetry. So she was a proto-woman rabbi who was writing for communal occasions. She wrote poems for weddings, for funerals, right? So she was officiating at all, on all of these occasions, but without the title. And so this particular poem really struck me because it uses the language of tying of knots. And it also is historical in that it's the first poem that we have by a woman dedicated to another woman and their relationship, their friendship, their familial relationship. I mean, we have women's relationships in the Bible, but let's face it, what are those relationships like? By and large, with the exception of Ruth and Naomi, they're antagonistic rivalries with women vying over who is going to procreate more, or women who are co-wives vying for primacy in their relationships. We have no indication of mother-daughter relationships, nor do we have anything that even with a whiff of like friendship. And I was having this amazing experience at Maharat of a very deep havruta with another woman, in this case, a woman named Lindsay Goodharts, Dr. Lindsay, now Rabbah Dr. Lindsay Goodharts, who lives in London, who was told that upon her ordination by Maharat, she would no longer be allowed to teach in any Orthodox synagogue in England or no longer be able to assume the position that she had at Jews College in London, London College of Jewish Studies, because becoming a rabbi was a subversive, you know, a violation of tradition. And so I was eager to see the ways in which women's study relationships, women's emotional relationships, could be brought into the conversation. And when I taught this material, you should note, it was at the end of Minyan. So it was happening in a prayer context. So it was as though this teaching was serving as a supplementary siddur. So this is the poem that Rachel Luzzatto Morpurgo wrote for her cousin Rachel, cousin Rachel, on the occasion of her marriage to a man by the last name of Sulam. If you think of Jacob's Sulam, Sulam Yaakov, Jacob's ladder, and what it means for her to leave Trieste, where they lived together, to Padua, and how they were going to maintain their connection, their ties to one another across that distance. So this is the one poem that I am going to take the time to read to you in Hebrew, and then in English, just so that you can hear the effect of the rhyme scheme of the poem. Oh, and I'll note that there's the epigraph to the poem Lazot Yikareh Hefzi Ba. This one shall be called My Delight is with Her, is taken from the book of Isaiah, and there it's the people of Israel, the feminized people of Israel, who are considered God's delight. Most of the time, if you have the feminine represented, it's in this hetero connection of a love relationship between a man and a woman, the woman being the personified feminized Israel, and the man being God. This is different, to take that kind of loving relationship and imagine it between two women. Rachel im Rachel niksheret, ke'anak ale gargeret, avatech li tiferet, al roshi hinach koteret. טוב טעמך מכל פרפרת, לי ינעם, אך את סותרת החברה, להיות נבחרת מסולם אל עיר אחרת. שירה זאת הינה מזכרת אהבה מהיות נהדרת, הומיה אני שוררת. יום יום אל יום אשמע איגרת דברי שלום, גם אוגרת לשלמה רחל עטרת. Okay, so my question for you, and I do invite you to unmute and participate, is what is the affection, even before the effect, even before I read the translation, of hearing that eret, eret, eret over and over and over again, an a rhyme scheme. Yeah, Marlene.
It's musical. To me, it sounded like a song.
Beautiful.
An almost iambic pentameter. I thought you were going to start out with that.
Mm-hmm.
That was my impression.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to make one comment, by the way. I tuned in a little bit late. Didn't Rashi have a third daughter, Rachel?
Yes, yes. So Ruchama's poem seems to there were 4 daughters, and one is
I didn't know.
unnamed. We don't know because she died as a child.
Because I read there was a
Maggie
trilogy.
Anton's. Yes.
Yocheved, Rachel, and the third one.
Yes. Maggie Anton wrote these Rashi's
Were
daughters.
those fiction?
Yes, they are
That was
fictional.
all. Okay. I read Yocheved. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So what else about that rhyme scheme, which is extremely rare? It is very rare to have an a rhyme scheme. It's hard to pull off, though maybe a little bit easier in Hebrew. Any other ideas about why she would choose to do that? And she doesn't do this in other poems. Yeah, Elle?
It's all ending like in the feminine. It's just like a very feminine poem.
Yes.
Obviously
Especially
she's
when we think about Geveret, right? Being Mrs. So yes, it definitely accentuates that feminine ending and the significance of relating to someone in the feminine in a positive way. I'll add to it that if the whole problematic of the poem is how you maintain a connection to someone across distance, well, one of the ways in which you perform connection is by having the sound repeat and replicate. Right. So it's conjuring up constancy at a time when constancy is threatened. Okay, lovely. So this is the poem in English. Rachel and Rachel are connected like a necklace to a neck. Your love is my laurel, on my head a crowning glory. To me, your wisdom is prized above all desert, but you're leaving our small cohort to be lifted tall on a ladder in another capital. This poem is a memento of love now absent. Longingly I chant. Daily shall I send mail, bear greetings to regale Solomon and his jewel, Rachel. Okay, so what do you, those of you who studied literature, what are you noting in terms of the form of the poem in addition to it having this AAA rhyme? Count the lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
Yeah,
6.
I was gonna say it's the 4 4 3 3. I forget what the name of that is though, but
Okay, so it's a sonnet.
it's not okay,
It's a
right.
sonnet, which is a 14 love poem comprised of an octave, um, 2 4-line stanzas, and then a sestet, 2 3-line stanzas. There is sonnets were most famously were famously popularized by Petrarch in the Italian tradition, love poems, and
Mm.
by Shakespeare,
Shakespeare.
love poems. And so the idea of a love sonnet of one woman to another is a major change. It's a continuity that is also a disruption. Now, the thing about a sonnet is that the first part sets out a thesis and then there's a turn. And so the turn here is the acknowledgement that she's leaving. That this poem is a memento of love now absent. Like, what does it mean for that? We know, I mean, those of us who have strong female friendships, we know how indispensable they are and how intimate they are, how connected women's friendships are to one another, connected women are to one another, and yet our tradition doesn't give a voice to that. So, acknowledging what a loss this must have been, and yet hanging on to language and to letters as a way of being able to maintain the connection. So she says, daily I'm going to wait for an egeret, for a letter from you. One other thing that I'll add is she's talking about the fact that her Rachel is marrying a guy whose name is Sulam, and we know that Yaakov famously had this dream of a ladder, of a Sulam Yaakov, and so she is recognized, she's imagining her ascending the ladder through this marriage. She's not wanting to be a downer at a wedding. She's wanting to celebrate this, but also figure out a way to make a space for the ongoing women's friendship, that marriage doesn't have to come between them. It's important for me to give credit where credit is due. So if you're interested in learning more about Rachel Mupurgo, who is a tremendously interesting figure, the foremost scholar of her poetry is a woman named Tova Cohen, who teaches at Bar Ilan University, and she came out with this monumental edition of Rachel Mupurgo's poetry. There are a few of her writings about Rachel Mupurgo that are available in English. She wrote an essay for the journal that I edit, which is called Proof Texts. And this is the cover of my book, And Rachel Stole the Idols, where I also write about Rachel Mupurgo. How are we doing time-wise?
It's 3 o'clock, so I
Yeah,
think
we're just unfortunately, I feel like
Okay.
we could continue this discussion for a very
Yeah.
long time.
Yeah, I'll just add by saying that the last poem that I teach in the book is by this man, Amir Gilboa, and it's called A Ball Out of Pain, Kadur Min Hatsa'ar. So going back to Beth's introduction, my whole goal in writing this book was to figure out a way to use language, literature, poetry as a tool of healing for myself and for my community. And the word kadur in Hebrew means 3 things. It means ball, so that's something you can play with. It means bullet. Kadur means bullet, and it also means a pill, like a remedy. And that language, we know that language the pen can be more mighty than the sword. Language can be a weapon. So often language is weaponized, so that, you know, people are provoked through language to do heinous things like the Tree of Life killer. But so much of our work is about trying to rescue language, and restore it to its prior, better, humane usages, both to, you know, to bring joy, to bring and to bring healing, at times like this.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say, I thought this was very meaningful because you talked about both the personal and the communal, and I think that's really something that's difficult here. Someone said this morning at shul to one of my congregants who lost someone, we're doing something for the 11. And I thought, well, it's not for the 11. You know, this is one particular person. These are all specific individual people whose families suffered losses, but they're also, it's also a communal loss. And I think it's something that we have to negotiate every year. So I really appreciate your words, Rabbi Zierler, in helping us grapple with how something is both a personal and a communal loss. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I thank you so much, and I'll just let you know that I put in the chat the link to my book if any of you want to be able to learn more about it.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thank you.
have a meaningful day, everybody.
Well, I think Carol's going to
yes.
conclude with Kaddish.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yes. Thank you.
Actually, it's okay. That I was honored to have been asked to lead all of us in the Kaddish Rabbanan, but you know, we say, right, Ein Milim, I have no words. I've been here 3 years, and I've been in my head writing a letter to each of the 11 murdered victims, asking them to please understand, trust me, bring me wisdom, that the work that we all do together, may they truly be a blessing. Their memory and what we do here in Pittsburgh and beyond, that no more Jews should be attacked, killed, murdered in the name of praying as Jews. Hearing your beautiful Hebrew, Rabbi Zierler, I'm actually going to defer to you and ask if you would please honor us in leading the Kaddish Rabbanan. I'm a little teary. It's been, as Beth said, both personal and communal, and it would be just such a beautiful honor to hear your voice.
I'm very honored, and I'll just note that each of the teachings that I did, the poem teachings that I did, were to give an opportunity for a Kaddish de Rabbanan, right? So at the end of our minyan, we have these classes so that we can add that last Kaddish. So it says something also about the importance. It's like we never get enough of this prayer, and that we want also to get back to the original Kaddish was the rabbi's Kaddish before it became a mourner's Kaddish. So I'll be delighted. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah. בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי וחייכון ויומכון וחיי דכל בית ישראל בעגלה ובזמן קריב ימרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם עולמי עלמיה יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה תמירם ועמה ויאמרו אמן. על ישראל ועל רבנן ועל תלמידי הון ועל כל תלמידי הון ועל כל מן דעסקים באורייתא דיברתרא הדין ודי בכל אתר ואתר יהא להון ולכון שלמה רבה חינה וחיסתא ורחמי וחיי אריכי ומזוני רוויחי ופורקנה מן קדם אבוין בישעיה ויאמרו
Amen.
יהא שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן.
Amen.
עושה שלום ירמיו hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimeru.
Amen.
Amen.
Beth, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Nasa, thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi
And
Zieler.
Thank
Rabbi
you.
Zierler, really, what a beautiful, beautiful way to mark today. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you so much for coming.
Thank you all very much.
Very
Take care.
sweet. Take care. Bye.
Bye.